Mine. He did not ask. He did not explain. He simply looked at her across the crowded ballroom and said it like a vow. Mine. Welcome to Aristocratic Hearts. I'm so glad you found your way here. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you right now? What time is it? I love knowing that we are all here together, scattered across the globe, connected by these stories. Tonight's story is one I have been carrying with me for days. It is about a girl who was married off at 17 to a man who treated her like an inconvenience, a man who moved his mistress into their home before the wedding flowers had wilted, and who spent 6 years making her believe she was worth nothing. But it is also about the Duke who watched her from across every ballroom, every dinner, every season, the man who memorized the exact moment her smile would die each evening, and who spent 6 years waiting for the right moment to burn her husband's world to the ground. This is not just a story about revenge. This is about what happens when a woman who has forgotten her own worth is finally seen by someone who never looked away. Let me take you back to England, 1845, where a 17-year-old girl in a dress that was too heavy for her shoulders walked down the aisle toward a man who did not bother to smile. She was 17 years old, and the dress was too heavy. That was what Felicity remembered most about her wedding day. Not the church, not the vows, not the cold grey eyes of the man who would become her husband. She remembered the weight of the gown pressing down on her shoulders, ivory satin and seed pearls that her mother had chosen without asking her opinion, because no one had asked Felicity's opinion about anything. Not the dress, not the church, not the man standing at the altar with his hands clasped behind his back and his expression suggesting he was enduring a mild inconvenience. Lord Godfrey Sutton, the Earl of Westbrook, was 40 years old on the day he married Felicity Varden. He had thinning hair the colour of wet sand, a jaw that had long since surrendered to softness, and the particular brand of arrogance that comes from inheriting a title and a fortune without earning either. He did not smile when she walked toward him. He did not reach for her hand. He simply watched her approach with the detached interest of a man inspecting a horse he had already purchased. Her father had arranged the match 3 months earlier, over brandy and cigars in Godfrey's London study. Felicity had not been present for the conversation. She learned of her engagement the way she learned of most things that shaped her life. Second hand, after the fact, from her mother's careful, practiced tone. "Lord Westbrook has offered for you," her mother had said, folding linen with the precision of a woman who believed that if she kept her hands busy enough, no one would notice the tremor in them. "Your father has accepted. The wedding will be in June." Felicity had been reading by the window. She set the book down carefully, as though it might shatter. "I have never spoken to Lord Westbrook." "You do not need to have spoken to him. He is an earl. He has 12,000 a year and an estate in Berkshire. You are the third daughter of a baronet with no fortune and diminishing prospects. This is not a conversation, Felicity. It is a kindness." And so she married him. Because in 1845, England, that was what a girl with no fortune did. She married whoever would have her, and she was grateful, and she did not complain. Now, it is important to understand something about marriage in this era. When Felicity spoke those vows, she did not merely gain a husband. She lost herself. Under the laws of coverture, a married woman had no separate legal existence. Her property became his property. Her earnings, if she had any, became his earnings. She could not sign a contract, could not sue, could not own so much as a hairpin in her own name. The moment she said, "I do," Felicity Varden ceased to exist as a person in the eyes of English law. She became an extension of Godfrey Sutton, like his carriage or his hunting dogs, something he owned, The wedding breakfast was held at Westbrook Hall, a sprawling Georgian estate that smelled of beeswax and old money, and centuries of inherited indifference. Felicity moved through the reception like a sleepwalker, accepting congratulations from people she did not know, smiling until her cheeks ached, sipping champagne that tasted like vinegar on her nervous tongue. Her husband spoke to her twice during the entire event. The first time was to tell her that her seat was on his left. The second was to inform her that the east wing was hers, and she was not to enter his study without invitation. That night, he came to her chamber. He was efficient and silent. Afterwards, he left without a word. She lay in the enormous bed with its canopy of cream silk, staring at the ceiling, listening to his footsteps recede down the corridor, and she thought, "This is my life now." She was wrong. It was about to get much worse. Lady Adela Cartwright arrived at Westbrook Hall on a Tuesday afternoon in September, 4 months after the wedding. She came in a carriage lacquered in deep green, with 3 trunks of clothing and a lady's maid who refused to eat in the servants' hall. She was 32 years old, dark-haired, sharp-featured, and she walked through the front door of Felicity's home as though she owned every stone of it, which in a sense she did, because Lady Adela Cartwright had owned Godfrey Sutton, or whatever sat in the space where a heart should have been, for the better part of a decade. She had been his mistress before the marriage, during the courtship, and now, apparently, she intended to be his mistress after the wedding as well. Not discreetly, as society might have tolerated, not in a separate house in town, as was customary among men of his class. She was moving in. Felicity learned this the way she learned everything, from the servants. Her lady's maid, Prue Hewitt, a woman of 50 with steel-grey hair and the diplomatic instincts of a foreign ambassador, delivered the news while brushing out Felicity's hair that evening. "My lady," Prue said carefully, "you should know that Lady Cartwright has been given the Rose bedroom, on the same corridor as his lordship's chambers." Felicity's brush stilled against the dressing table. "On the same corridor?" "Yes, my lady. And I am in the east wing." "Yes, my lady." The silence that followed was the kind that fills rooms like smoke. Felicity looked at her own reflection in the mirror. 17 years old, thin-shouldered, brown-haired, ordinary. And she understood something with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its devastation. She was not his wife. She was his cover, his respectability, the plain, forgettable girl whose existence allowed him to keep the woman he actually wanted without scandal. "Thank you, Prue," she said. "That will be all." Prue hesitated, her hand hovering near Felicity's shoulder, and for a moment something fierce flickered behind the older woman's carefully composed expression. But she said nothing. She set the brush down and left, closing the door with the gentleness of someone trying not to wake a person from a terrible dream. The first year was the worst, because she still had hope. Felicity tried. She tried to be a good wife, whatever that meant when your husband dined with his mistress every evening while you ate alone in the east wing. She tried to run the household, but Lady Adela had already assumed control of the menus, the staff, the entertaining. She tried to make conversation at breakfast, but Godfrey looked at her over his newspaper as though she were a stain on the tablecloth he could not quite identify. "Must you always be here?" he said one morning, not with cruelty. Cruelty would have required him to care enough to be cruel. He said it with the flat irritation of a man whose routine had been disturbed. "This is my home," Felicity said quietly. "It is my home," he corrected, turning a page. "You are a guest." She stopped coming to breakfast. By the second year, she stopped attending dinners. By the third, she rarely left the east wing at all. Prue brought her meals on trays. She read. She walked the gardens in the early mornings before anyone else was awake, moving through the dew-soaked roses like a ghost haunting her own life. The servants pitied her. She could see it in the way they averted their eyes, in the extra biscuit left on her tea tray, in the way the stable boy always had her favourite mare saddled and waiting, even though she had not requested a ride. Adela, meanwhile, flourished. She redecorated the drawing room. She hired new servants. She hosted dinners and card parties and invited her friends from London, all of whom treated Felicity with the particular brand of politeness that is worse than rudeness. Ni ki asam, the kind that says we see you, we know exactly what you are, and we find it amusing. "Oh, Lady Westbrook," one of Adela's friends purred at a dinner Felicity had been commanded to attend. "How generous of you to share your home with dear Adela. Most wives would not be so accommodating." The table laughed. All of them. Even Godfrey, who was on his fourth glass of claret and whose hand was resting on Adela's knee beneath the tablecloth. Even Adela, whose smile was the smile of a woman who has won and wants you to know it. Felicity did not laugh. She set down her fork. She folded her napkin. And she excused herself with a voice so steady it surprised even her. It was only when she reached her bedroom, only when the door was closed and the lock was turned, that she pressed her back against the wood and slid to the floor and let the tears come. Silently. Because she had learned by then that even her grief was not supposed to make noise. And she had no idea, none at all, that the man who would change everything was about to enter her life. Or rather, that he had already been in it, watching her from a distance so carefully measured that not a single soul in England had noticed. But first, there is something else you need to know about Felicity Varden, something Godfrey never noticed, because Godfrey never noticed anything about his wife that did not directly inconvenience him. In the solitude of the East Wing, surrounded by books and silence and the particular kind of loneliness that sharpens the mind rather than dulling it, Felicity had been reading. Not novels, or not only novels, she had been reading law. It started by accident. A volume of Blackstone's commentaries left behind by a visiting solicitor had found its way into the library, and Felicity, who read everything she could reach, had opened it out of boredom. What she found inside changed the architecture of her despair. She read about coverture. She read about dower rights. She read about the circumstances, vanishingly rare, almost impossibly difficult, under which a woman might petition for a separation through the ecclesiastical courts, or, in the most extreme cases, seek a private act of Parliament to dissolve her marriage entirely. She learned that such petitions required proof of adultery, which Godfrey committed openly, nightly, under her own roof, compounded by an aggravating circumstance such as cruelty or desertion. She learned that in the entire history of English law fewer than half a dozen women had ever succeeded, and she began, quietly and methodically, to document everything. Not with any plan, not with any hope, simply because the act of writing things down, dates, amounts, names, the precise wording of Godfrey's cruelties, gave her the illusion of control in a life where she had none. She kept the journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her dressing room. Prue knew about it. No one else did. And in that journal, in Felicity's neat, careful hand, was a record so meticulous, so thorough, so devastatingly complete, that it would one day become the foundation upon which a duke built an empire of vengeance. But that day was still years away. And what happened next would test her endurance in ways she could not yet imagine. The Duke of Darlington first saw Felicity Varden on the evening of her debut, 6 months before her wedding. She would not have remembered it. There was no reason for her to remember it. She had been one of dozens of girls presented at Almack's that season, shy, slender, forgettable, in a room full of girls who were trying very hard not to be forgotten. She had worn white muslin. She had stood near the wall. She had not been asked to dance. But Marius, Hargrove, the seventh Duke of Darlington, remembered every detail. He remembered the way she held her glass of lemonade with both hands, as though it were the only anchor keeping her from drifting out of the room entirely. He remembered the way she watched the other girls dancing with an expression that was not jealousy, but something quieter and more painful. Acceptance. He remembered the exact moment she smiled at a passing servant who had stumbled, a real smile, the kind that started in her eyes and transformed her entire face, and he remembered thinking, "There you are." He was 27 years old that night, already a duke for 3 years following his father's death, already considered one of the most powerful men in England. He had dark hair, grey eyes the colour of December skies, and a reputation for silence that made lesser men nervous. He did not dance. He did not flirt. He attended social functions with the grim endurance of a man fulfilling a contractual obligation, and he left the moment propriety allowed. But that night, he did not leave early. He stood against a pillar of white marble, and he watched a girl. No one else was watching, and he felt something shift inside his chest. A mechanism clicking into place, a door opening that would never close again. He made inquiries the following day, discreetly, because Marius Hargrove did everything discreetly. He learned her name. He learned her family's circumstances, a baronet's third daughter, no fortune, no prospects, no particular beauty by society's cruel standards. He learned that her favourite place in any room was near the bookshelves. He learned that she had a habit of pressing her thumbnail into her palm when she was nervous, a tiny violence against herself that no one else seemed to notice. He intended to court her. He was going to approach her father, do things properly, give her the life she deserved. And then 3 weeks later he heard that she was engaged to Lord Westbrook. The glass of brandy he was holding when he received the news cracked in his hand. Not shattered, cracked. A single line running from rim to base, as though the glass itself understood that something had broken. His man of business, Seaton Graves, a lean, fox-faced man who had served the Hargrove family for 20 years, was the one who delivered the information. "Westbrook?" Marius said. His voice was very quiet. People who knew him well, and there were very few, knew that the quieter his voice became, the more dangerous the territory. "Yes, Your Grace. The banns have been read." "Westbrook is 40 years old." "Yes, Your Grace." "And she is 17. "Yes, Your Grace." Marius set down the cracked glass. He placed both hands flat on his desk. He was silent for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Find out everything about Lord Westbrook, everything, his finances, his habits, his vices, the woman he keeps in town, the debts he hides, everything." Seaton Graves did not ask why. He had served the Duke of Darlington long enough to recognize the sound of a man who has made a decision from which he will never retreat. "And Graves," Marius added, as the man reached the door. "Your Grace." "This does not end. Not until I say it ends." And it didn't. What happened over the next 6 years would become the most patient, most meticulous, most devastating act of devotion this country had ever seen. But I am getting ahead of myself. 6 years. For 6 years Marius watched. He attended every ball she attended. He positioned himself in corners, behind columns, in doorways, always where he could see her without being seen. He learned the rhythm of her evenings, the way a sailor learns the tide. The precise moment she would arrive, always 15 minutes after the stated hour. The way she would pause just inside the door, scanning the room not for friendly faces but for safe corners. The small adjustment of her gloves, pulling them higher on her wrists as though armoring herself. The careful, practiced smile she placed on her face like a mask before stepping into the light. He watched the light leave her eyes, season by season, year by year, the way autumn strips a tree bare until there is nothing left but branches and the memory of what once grew there. The first year she still tried. She would approach groups of women and attempt conversation, and he would watch the way they turned their shoulders just slightly. Not enough to be rude, but enough to say, "You are not one of us." He watched her retreat each time, with her chin held high and her knuckles white around her fan. He wanted to cross the room every single time. He did not. The second year, she stopped trying. She found her corners, her shadows, her safe places near the bookshelves and behind the potted ferns, and she stayed in them, like a creature that has learned where the predators cannot reach. The third year, he noticed she had stopped wearing colour. Everything was grey or dark blue or black, muted tones that seemed designed to make her vanish against the wallpaper. The gowns were fewer, too. 3, rotated carefully, because Godfrey had stopped giving her a dress allowance and had redirected the funds to Adela's modiste instead. The fourth year she grew thinner. He could see it in the sharpening of her collarbones, in the way her gloves began to gap at the wrists. She ate less at dinners. He watched this too, pushing food around her plate with the mechanical precision of someone who has lost their appetite for more than food. The fifth year, he noticed the bruise. It was October, Lady Rendell's autumn ball. Felicity was wearing the dark blue gown, the one he had memorized down to the thread count, and her hair was pinned in a way that partially obscured the left side of her face. But the candlelight caught it when she turned. A shadow that was not a shadow. A yellowing mark along her cheekbone that powder could not quite conceal. Marius set down his champagne glass. The stem snapped clean off in his hand. He did not notice. He was staring at her face across 40 feet of polished floor, and something inside him, something he had kept on a very short leash for 5 years, strained against its chains so hard he could feel it in his teeth. He did not cross the room that night either. But he left the ball early, returned to Darlington House, sat in the dark of his study for 3 hours, and when dawn came, he summoned Seaton Graves and gave him a single, quiet instruction that would set the final phase of his plan into motion. And while he watched, Graves worked. Every year, Marius commissioned a portrait, not of himself, of her. He hired different artists each time, instructed them to attend the same events, to observe her from a distance, to capture her as she truly was. Not posed, not performing. Just her, sitting by a window, standing at the edge of a ballroom, walking alone in a garden she thought was empty. 6 portraits. 6 years. Each one hung in a room on the 3rd floor of Darlington House that no one entered but him. He went to that room every night. He stood before those paintings. 6 versions of the same woman growing dimmer year by year like a candle running out of wax. And he made himself look. He made himself witness what was being done to her, because the anger had to be tended. It had to be kept alive and hot and precise, or it would fade into something useless like resignation. Marius Hargrove did not resign. He planned. And while he watched, Seaton Graves worked. The file on Lord Westbrook grew thick as a Bible. Gambling debts hidden through a maze of moneylenders. Rents raised on his tenants to the point of cruelty. A bastard child in Shropshire he had never acknowledged. Forged signatures on 3 separate financial documents. Tax evasion so brazen it bordered on contemptuous. And worst of all, the thing that made Marius's hand close into a fist the night Graves laid it before him. Evidence that Godfrey had struck his wife. Once, as far as Graves could determine, a single backhanded blow across her cheekbone on a night when Godfrey had drunk too much port, and Felicity had made the mistake of asking him to dismiss Lady Cartwright. The bruise had been explained as a fall on the stairs. The servants knew the truth. Everyone always knew the truth. No one did anything, because she was his wife, and his wife was his property, and a man could do what he liked with his property in 1849. The night Marius read that report, he did not sleep. He sat in the room with her portraits. 6 versions of the same woman, growing dimmer, year by year. And he made a list. Every person who had laughed at her, every hostess who had seated her at the far end of the table, every woman who had whispered behind her back, every man who had watched Godfrey parade his mistress through London and said nothing. The list was long. The list was thorough. The list was patient. Because Marius Hargrove was not a man who acted in haste. He was a man who believed that revenge, like wine, improved with time. And he had been aging this particular vintage for 6 years. The London season of 1851 opened in April with Lord and Lady Pemberton's ball, and it was there, on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, that Marius Hargrove finally stopped watching and started moving. Felicity almost did not attend. She had stopped attending most events by this point. What was the purpose, when every ballroom was merely a different stage for the same humiliation? But Godfrey had insisted. He needed her present for appearances, he said. He was seeking a position on a parliamentary committee, and a wife who never appeared in public was beginning to attract the wrong kind of attention. "Wear something appropriate," he told her, barely glancing up from his correspondence. "And try not to look so miserable. It reflects poorly on me." She wore a gown of deep blue silk, one of the 3 she rotated, let out twice by Prue to accommodate the weight she had lost. She wore no jewels because the family jewels had been given to Adela 3 years ago, in a gesture so brazen that even the servants had whispered about it. She wore her hair pinned simply, because there was no lady's maid to do anything elaborate. Godfrey had dismissed hers and never replaced her, and Prue, blessed Dee, her was a woman of many talents, but hairdressing was not among them. She arrived at the Pemberton ball like a shadow slipping through a door, present but determined not to be noticed. She did not know that across the room, leaning against a marble column with a glass of champagne he had not touched, the Duke of Darlington had been waiting for her for 47 minutes. He watched her enter. He watched her scan the room for a quiet corner. He watched her find one, near the potted ferns behind a carved screen. And he watched her settle into it with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had made invisibility into an art form. And then he moved. The ballroom was crowded, 300 guests at least, and the distance between his column and her corner was perhaps 40 feet. He crossed it in 12 strides. Later, Felicity would remember the sound of those footsteps, steady, unhurried, inevitable, cutting through the noise of the orchestra and the chatter and the clinking glasses like a blade through silk. She did not look up until his shadow fell across her. Lady Westbrook. His voice was low, not soft. There was nothing soft about the Duke of Darlington. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising his volume, the kind of voice that made rooms go quiet and lesser men step aside. Felicity looked up. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in black evening clothes that made his grey eyes look almost silver in the candlelight. She did not know him. She was certain she did not know him. And yet something about the way he looked at her, with an intensity that bordered on pain, made her breath catch in her throat. "I do not believe we have been introduced, Your Grace," she said, because she could tell from his bearing, from the way the crowd had parted around him like water around stone, that he was someone of considerable rank. "We have not," he said. "I am Darlington." The name rippled through her awareness like a stone dropped in still water. Everyone knew the Duke of Darlington, not because he was social. He was the opposite. He was known for his silence, his wealth, his ruthlessness in business, and the fact that he had refused every eligible woman in England for the past decade. He was by every account the most powerful unmarried man in the country, and he was standing in front of her as though the rest of the ballroom had ceased to exist. "Your Grace," she said, and began to rise because one did not remain seated when a duke was standing. "Please." He gestured for her to stay. "May I sit?" She blinked. Dukes did not ask permission to sit. Dukes sat where they pleased. "Of course." He sat beside her, not across from her, as propriety would suggest, beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, sandalwood and something darker, something that made her think of libraries and winter, evenings and rooms where important decisions were made. "You are wondering why I am here," he said. "I am wondering many things, Your Grace." "I have watched you," he said, and the directness of it stunned her into silence. "For 6 years I have watched you enter every ballroom in London and find the darkest corner and disappear into it. I have watched you smile at servants and freeze at the approach of your peers. I have watched your husband parade his mistress through society while you sit alone, and I have watched you bear it with a dignity that would shame every person in this room if they had the capacity for shame." Felicity could not speak. Her hands were trembling in her lap, and she pressed her thumbnail into her palm. That old, unconscious habit. And she saw his gaze drop to her hands, and she saw something move behind his eyes that frightened her. Not because it threatened her, because it looked like fury held on a leash, so short it was a miracle the leash had not snapped. "Your Grace," she began, "you pressed your thumbnail into your palm just now," he said. "You do that when you are frightened. You also do it when you are pretending not to cry." The breath left her body. No one had ever noticed that. Not her mother, not her husband, not Prue, who noticed everything. "How?" "I told you. I have been watching you for 6 years. He set his untouched champagne on the windowsill beside him. "I know that you prefer white camellias to roses. I know that you read more quickly when you are upset. I know that you hum under your breath when you walk in gardens, and that the song is always the same. A hymn, I believe, something your mother taught you. I know that you are left-handed, but eat with your right, because someone corrected you as a child. I know that the blue gown you are wearing tonight is the same one you wore to the Ashworth dinner 3 months ago, and that it has been let out twice. I know that you smile at servants and freeze at the approach of your peers, and I know that the last time you laughed, genuinely laughed, was at a puppet show in Hyde Park 2 years ago, when a child beside you spilled lemonade on your skirt and you told her it was the most exciting thing that had happened to you all season." Felicity's eyes were burning. Her hands were trembling in her lap, and her throat was so tight she could barely breathe. No one had ever catalogued her like this. No one had ever paid enough attention to know these things. She was a woman who had spent 6 years being overlooked by the one person who was supposed to see her, and now a stranger, a duke, was reciting the details of her life with the reverence of a man reading scripture. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. He leaned closer, not touching her. He was careful not to touch her, careful in a way that suggested he had thought about touching her and decided against it with great effort. "Because I am done watching," he said. "I am done. I am done standing in corners. I am done being patient. And I am done allowing a man who does not deserve to breathe the same air as you to waste one more day of your life." And that, my friends, was the moment everything changed. But she had no idea, not yet, just how completely this man was about to dismantle her entire world and rebuild it around her. In the days that followed, Felicity told herself it meant nothing. A duke had spoken to her at a ball. It happened. It did not mean anything. He was probably bored or drunk or making some sort of wager with his friends. Men of his stature did not notice women like her. She was 23, married, plain, invisible. She was nobody. But then the flowers arrived. Not roses. Everyone sent roses. He sent white camellias, her favourite flower, which she had mentioned exactly once 3 years ago at a garden party to a woman who was not listening. Somehow, he had been. The card read simply, Darlington. Godfrey saw them on the hall table and frowned. "Who is sending you flowers?" "I do not know," she lied, and the lie came out so smoothly it startled her. She had never lied to her husband before. There had never been anything worth lying about. The following week, at Lady Thornton's musicale, the Duke of Darlington appeared again. He did not approach her immediately. He spent the first hour on the opposite side of the room, speaking with 2 members of Parliament and a shipping magnate, his expression suggesting he was discussing something that would bore lesser men to tears. But his eyes found her across the room no fewer than 7 times. She counted. During the interval, he materialized beside her as though he had simply formed from the candlelight and shadow. "You are wearing the same gown you wore to the Pemberton ball," he said. She felt her cheeks flush. "I was not aware your Grace was cataloguing my wardrobe." "I catalogue everything about you, Lady Westbrook. It is, I confess, an obsession I have stopped trying to cure." She should have been alarmed. She should have excused herself, found her husband, retreated to the safety of her invisible corner. Instead, she heard herself say, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The music resumed. Someone was playing Chopin, badly, and in the shelter of that imperfect melody he said, "Because you are the only real thing in every room you enter, and I have spent 6 years in rooms full of people who are pretending." I know what you are thinking right now. You are thinking, why didn't she just leave with him? Why didn't she take his hand and walk out of that miserable marriage? Keep listening. Because the walls around Felicity Varden were not built of stone. They were built of law and custom, and a society that considered a wife who left her husband to be worse than a husband who destroyed his wife. Their meetings continued, always in public, always observed by 100 pairs of eyes, which was precisely the point. Marius was too intelligent to compromise her reputation, and Felicity was too careful to give Godfrey ammunition. But within the constraints of public propriety, something extraordinary began to grow. He sought her out at every event. He brought her lemonade when no one else remembered she existed. He stood beside her during concerts and translated the Italian arias into English in a low murmur that only she could hear. He discussed books with her. Real discussions, not the patronizing summaries men offered women. And when she disagreed with his assessment of a particular novel, he did not dismiss her opinion. He considered it. He argued back. He treated her mind as something worth engaging with, and the effect on Felicity was like sunlight on a plant that had been kept in a cellar. She began to stand straighter. She began to smile. Not the careful, practiced smile she wore like armor, but the real one, the one that started in her eyes. It was during the 3rd week of their strange, public, entirely proper courtship that the jealousy incident occurred. And it revealed something about the Duke of Darlington that Felicity was not prepared for. Lord Hatherley, a viscount of middling fortune and wandering hands, had apparently decided that if a duke could pay attention to Lady Westbrook, then perhaps she was worth noticing after all. He approached her at the Wyndham supper party, while Marius was momentarily detained by the Foreign Secretary, and he stood too close. He leaned in to murmur something that required no murmuring. His hand found the small of her back. Felicity stiffened. She shifted away. Hatherley followed. "My lord, you are standing very close." "Am I? Forgive me. It is only that I have recently noticed what a compelling presence you have, Lady Westbrook." "I have the same presence I have had for 6 years. You did not find it compelling then." His smile tightened. "Perhaps I was distracted, but I am attentive now." His hand moved from the small of her back to her elbow. "Very attentive." Remove your hand. The voice came from behind Hatherley, and it was not loud. It did not need to be. Every person within 15 feet went silent. Hatherley turned, and whatever colour he had in his face drained out of it like water from a cracked glass. Marius stood 3 feet away. His expression was perfectly composed. That was the terrifying part. There was no visible anger, no clenched jaw, no raised voice, just those grey eyes, steady as gravestones, focused on Hatherley's hand, where it rested on Felicity's elbow. "Your Grace, I was merely—" "I know what you were doing. I am telling you to stop." Hatherley released Felicity's arm as though it had burned him. He stammered something about misunderstandings and retreated so quickly he bumped into a waiter carrying a tray of oysters. The oysters went everywhere. Hatherley kept walking. Marius turned to Felicity. The terrifying composure softened by exactly 1 degree. "Are you well?" "I am. You did not need to—" "Yes," he said, "I did." Something in his voice, that quiet, absolute certainty, made her stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She realized, with a start, that she wanted him to touch her. Not the way Hatherley had. Possessory. Invasive. The way Marius did not. The way he held himself at a precise distance, close enough to feel the warmth of him, but never close enough to make contact, as though he had drawn an invisible line and refused to cross it until she invited him. That restraint, she would later understand, was the most seductive thing about him. In a world where men took what they wanted from women without asking, Marius Hargrove waited. And if you think that is the most intense this story gets, I promise you, we have barely begun. Keep listening. And the ton noticed. Of course they noticed. They noticed everything. The Duke of Darlington, the man who spoke to no one, danced with no one, showed interest in no one, was suddenly appearing at events he had avoided for a decade. And he was spending every available moment with the Earl of Westbrook's neglected, unremarkable wife. The whispers began like a slow tide. "Have you seen Darlington and Lady Westbrook? Quite extraordinary. What on earth does he see in her? She is hardly a beauty. Perhaps he pities her. Everyone knows about Westbrook and that Cartwright woman." "Pity? My dear, that is not pity, that is hunger. I have never seen a man look at a woman the way he looks at her." The whispers reached Godfrey within a fortnight. And for the first time in 6 years he looked at his wife, truly looked at her, with something other than indifference. Now, if you think you know what happens next, if you think this is the moment where everything falls neatly into place, I need you to keep listening. Because what Godfrey did when he finally noticed his wife was far worse than anything he had done while ignoring her. He found her in the East Wing sitting room reading by the window. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had the brittle quality of a man who has been told something he cannot quite believe. "Is it true that the Duke of Darlington has been paying you attention?" Felicity set down her book. "We have spoken at several events. He is courteous." "Courteous?" Godfrey repeated the word as though tasting something sour. "Darlington is courteous to no one. He is paying you attention, and I want to know why." "Perhaps you should ask him, my lord." Something shifted in Godfrey's expression. It was the first time his wife had answered him with anything other than quiet submission, and the novelty of it, the defiance, small as it was, seemed to unsettle him more than the Duke's attention. "You will not encourage him," Godfrey said. "I will not be made a fool of." Felicity looked at her husband. This man who had moved his mistress into their home, who had given her jewels to another woman, who had struck her once and never apologized. And she said very calmly, "You managed that quite well on your own, my lord." The silence that followed was the most dangerous kind. Godfrey's face darkened. His hand twitched at his side. But he did not strike her. Perhaps because the memory of the last time still lingered, or perhaps because some primitive instinct warned him that the landscape had shifted, that there were new forces in play he did not yet understand. He left without another word. That night, Felicity pressed her back against her bedroom door and realized her hands were not trembling. For the first time in 6 years, her hands were completely still. The first time they were alone, truly alone, was an accident. Or at least, Felicity believed it was an accident. Marius had planned it down to the minute. Lady Ashworth's house party in Surrey. A weekend of shooting and dinners and interminable conversation. Godfrey had been invited because he was campaigning for his parliamentary seat. Adela had come along because Adela went everywhere Godfrey went, and Marius had accepted the invitation for the first time in 6 years because Felicity would be there. It happened on the second evening. The house was old, the corridors were poorly lit, and Felicity had lost her way on the walk back from the library. She was carrying 3 books she had borrowed. 1 novel, a volume of Elizabethan poetry, and a history of the Plantagenets. And she was so absorbed in reading the opening pages of the novel by candlelight that she did not see the figure standing at the end of the corridor until she nearly walked into him. "Forgive me, She looked up. The candlelight from a wall sconce caught the sharp planes of his face, the grey eyes that seemed to hold their own light, and her words dissolved. "You are lost," he said. "I am not lost. I am exploring." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. She was not sure she had ever seen him truly smile. But it was the closest she had witnessed, and it transformed his face from something cold and imposing into something devastatingly human. "With 3 books, one can never be too prepared." "What are you reading?" She glanced down at the volumes in her arms, suddenly self-conscious. "The novel is Mrs. Gaskell's, the poetry is Spencer's, and the history is... well, it is rather dry, but there was very little else in the library that I had not already read." "You have been to this library before?" "No, but I have read widely." That almost smile again. "I know. I once watched you spend the entirety of Lady March's ball reading behind a curtain. You turned 87 pages. I counted." She stared at him. "You counted my pages." "I count everything about you. I am aware that this makes me sound alarming." "It makes you sound thorough." They stood there in the narrow corridor with its faded wallpaper and its single candle, throwing shadows that danced between them, and the silence was not empty. It was full of every glance across every ballroom, every word spoken and unspoken, every moment he had watched her and she had not known. She could smell the beeswax from the candle, and beneath it his cologne, sandalwood and something darker, and the old wood of the house, and rain against the windows somewhere above them, and the faintest trace of the coal fire from the library she had just left. Every sense felt sharpened, as though the dim corridor had stripped away the noise of the world and left only what mattered. "I should return to my room," she said. "You should." Neither of them moved. "Your Grace..." "Marius." His voice was rough. "When we are alone, if we are ever alone, my name is Marius. We should not be alone. No, this is improper. Yes." She looked at him, this man who had the power to buy and sell her husband 10 times over, who could command armies of solicitors and destroy reputations with a raised eyebrow. And she saw that his hands were gripped behind his back so tightly that the knuckles had gone white. He was holding himself in check. Every line of his body spoke of restraint, the careful, the deliberate restraint of a man who wanted something so badly that the wanting itself had become a form of discipline. "Why me?" she whispered. "Of all the women in England, beautiful women, wealthy women, women who are free, why me?" He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely audible, as though the words cost him something to release. "Because I watched you sit alone at a ball when you were 17 years old, and you smiled at a servant who had tripped, and in that single moment I saw more kindness, more grace, more genuine warmth than I have seen in every drawing-room and ballroom and country house in England combined. And I have not been able to look away since." Her eyes burned. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm, hard. "Don't," he said softly. She stilled. "Don't what?" "Don't hurt yourself. Not even that small amount. You have endured enough pain." The fact that he had noticed, that tiny private gesture she had never shown anyone, undid something inside her. A wall she had spent 6 years building, brick by careful brick, began to crack. And then something happened that neither of them planned for. One of the books slipped from her arms. She reached for it. He reached for it at the same moment. Their fingers collided. Not through gloves, because she had removed them in the library, and he had removed his at some earlier point in the evening. And the shock of skin on skin, unmediated, direct, was so acute that they both went still. He was holding her hand, or she was holding his. It was impossible to tell who had grasped whom. The book lay on the carpet between them, forgotten. His fingers were warm and rough and wrapped around hers with a gentleness that made her chest ache, and she could feel his pulse, fast, faster than his controlled exterior would ever suggest, beating against her wrist. He looked down at their joined hands. She watched his jaw tighten. She watched a muscle move in his throat. She watched his grip shift, not releasing, but adjusting, his thumb tracing a single, devastating line across her knuckles, so slow it might have been accidental if not for the way his breathing had changed. "Marius," she whispered. It was the first time she had used his name, and the effect on him was visible. A shudder that ran the length of his body, as though the sound of his name in her voice had physically struck him. He raised his eyes to hers. They were standing very close now. Close enough that she could see the individual shades in his grey irises. Silver near the pupil, darker at the edges like storm clouds seen from underneath. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath on her cheek. Close enough that if she tilted her face up by even a fraction, his free hand rose. It hovered near her jaw. She could feel the heat of his palm without him touching her. A phantom warmth that traced the line of her cheekbone, the curve of her ear, the place where her pulse hammered in her throat. He was so close to touching her face that the fine hairs on her skin stood on end. The air between them felt charged, heavy, as though the corridor itself were holding its breath. "I should not," he said. The words seemed to cost him everything. "No," she agreed. Her voice was barely a sound. His hand hovered. His eyes dropped to her mouth, and she felt with a certainty that terrified her that if he kissed her in this corridor she would not stop him. She would not want to stop him. She would lean into him and burn and not care about the consequences because this man had seen her, truly seen her. And she was so starved for that seeing that the hunger of it was eating her alive. His hand trembled. She could see it shaking, half an inch from her skin. Then footsteps echoed somewhere below them. A servant, carrying a tray, climbing the stairs. The sound broke the spell like a stone through glass. Marius withdrew his hand. He released hers. He took one step back, a single, precise step, as though he had measured the exact distance required to survive this moment without doing something irreversible. "I have to go," she said. "I know." She turned and walked away. She did not look back. But she heard him exhale behind her, a long, shattered breath, and she knew that she was not the only one whose walls were cracking. And she carried the ghost of his almost touch on her skin for days afterward. That hovering warmth along her jaw, the trembling nearness, the devastating restraint of a man who wanted her so badly that not touching her had become the hardest thing he had ever done. She thought that was the hardest part, the wanting, the waiting, the impossible closeness. She was wrong. What came next was worse, far worse, but what neither of them knew, what Marius could not possibly have anticipated, why, was that those walls were about to be tested in a way that would change the stakes of everything. Because Godfrey Sutton had finally realized that he was losing control of his wife, and men like Godfrey, when they feel control slipping, do not let go. They tighten their grip. After the house party, Godfrey began to notice things. His wife was different. He could not have articulated how exactly. It was not as though she had suddenly begun defying him openly or demanding changes. It was subtler than that. She held his gaze when she spoke. She did not flinch when he raised his voice. She moved through rooms with a quiet certainty that had not been there before, as though some internal compass that had been spinning wildly for 6 years had finally found its north. It irritated him profoundly. A wife was supposed to be manageable, grateful even for the life he provided. She was supposed to need him. That was the arrangement. He confronted her one evening in the East Wing, smelling of claret and Adela's perfume. "You will not see Darlington again." Felicity was mending a tear in her glove, the same gloves she had worn to her wedding, because she had not been given new ones in 4 years. She did not look up. "I see the Duke at public events. I cannot control who attends them." "Do not play coy with me." His voice dropped to that register she knew well, the one that preceded the backhand 3 years ago. "People are talking. My wife trailing after a duke like a lovesick schoolgirl. Do you have any idea how that makes me look?" Now she did look up. "I imagine it makes you look like a man whose wife has finally found someone who treats her with basic decency." The slap came so fast she did not see his hand move. One moment she was sitting, the next her cheek was burning and she was gripping the arm of the chair and the room was tilting sideways. She tasted copper. Her lip had split against her teeth. Godfrey stood over her, breathing hard, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that was not indifference or irritation. It was fear. He was afraid, not of what he had done, but of losing control, of losing the arrangement, of losing the quiet, manageable wife who made his life with Adela possible. "You will not see him again," he repeated, "or I will make your life unbearable." He left. Felicity sat very still for a long time, pressing her palm against her split lip, watching the blood bloom against her skin, and she thought, "You have been making my life unbearable for 6 years. The difference is that now someone has shown me it does not have to be. What happened next would change everything. Everything." When Prue came to her that night and saw the blood, the older woman did something she had never done in all her years of service. She sat down on the floor beside her mistress's chair, took her hand, and wept. "Let me send word," Prue whispered. "Let me send word to the Duke." "No," Felicity said. "Not yet." "My lady." "Not yet," she repeated. "When the time comes, it must be done properly. I will not give Godfrey the satisfaction of calling me an adulteress." She did not leave her chambers for 5 days. Godfrey, emboldened by her silence, told society she was ill with a headache. Adela ordered the servants to leave her trays outside the door. Felicity ate alone, read alone, slept alone, and pressed cold cloths against the bruise that bloomed across her cheekbone like an accusation. On the second night, She sat at the writing desk by the window, watching moonlight turn the garden silver, and she thought about the Duke of Darlington standing in a corridor, gripping his hands behind his back to keep from touching her, and she pressed her forehead against the cold glass and ached in a way that was entirely different from pain. It was the ache of wanting something she had stopped believing she was allowed to want. Meanwhile, at Darlington House, Marius was not sleeping either. He knew. Graves had informants among the Westbrook staff. He had maintained them for years, and the report of the slap reached him before dawn the next morning. He read it once. He set the paper down. He walked to the window of his study, placed both hands flat against the glass, and stood there for a very long time, his breath fogging the pane in slow, measured clouds. Then he went to the portrait room. He stood before the painting of her at 22, the one where she was reading in a corner, her face half lit by candlelight. And he said, to no one, to the silence, to the 6 painted versions of the woman he loved, enough. He did not sleep for 3 nights. He sat in his study with Graves, reviewing every document, every sworn statement, every piece of evidence they had accumulated over 6 years. He cross-referenced, he verified, he planned with the cold, meticulous precision of a military campaign, because that is what this was, a war. And he intended to win it so thoroughly that Godfrey Sutton would not have so much as a foothold left from which to fight. On the 3rd night, Graves looked at his employer, unshaven, hollow-eyed, still in the same clothes he had worn 3 days prior, and said carefully, "Your Grace, you should rest." "I will rest," Marius said, not looking up from the papers, "when she is safe." But before the plan could be set in motion, Godfrey made a move that nearly destroyed everything. On the 5th night of Felicity's confinement to her chambers, Godfrey came to the east wing. He had been drinking, she could smell the port from 6 feet away, and his face had the loosened, reckless quality of a man who has made a decision while drunk and is now too far into it to stop. "Get up," he said from the doorway. "We are going to the country." Felicity was sitting by the window. The bruise had faded to yellow. "I beg your pardon." "Westbrook Hall, tomorrow morning. You're going to the country, and you're going to stay there. Indefinitely." She understood immediately. He was removing her from London, from society, from the Duke of Darlington. He was going to bury her in the countryside the way men like him had buried inconvenient wives for centuries, behind hedgerows and stone walls and miles of empty road, where no one would see her and no one would care. "I will not go," she said. "You are my wife. You will do as you are told." "And if I refuse?" He crossed the room in 3 strides. He seized her arm, not her face this time, but her wrist, and twisted it behind her back with a force that sent a bolt of white-hot pain up her shoulder. She gasped. Her knees buckled. "You have no choice," he hissed against her ear. "You are my property. The law says so. God says so. And if I have to drag you into that carriage myself, I will." He released her. She fell against the writing desk, scattering papers and ink. The ink bottle shattered on the floor, bleeding black across the boards like a wound. "6 in the morning," he said from the doorway. "Be ready." Prue found her 20 minutes later, sitting on the floor in a pool of spilled ink, cradling her wrist against her chest. The older woman took one look, and the diplomatic composure she had maintained for 6 years shattered completely. "That is enough," Prue said. Her voice was shaking with something that was not fear. It was rage, the cold, bone-deep rage of a woman who has watched a girl she raised from childhood be destroyed by degrees. "I am sending word tonight, right now, this minute." This time, Felicity did not argue. The message reached Darlington House at 11 o'clock that night. Marius read it. He stood up. He put on his coat. And he did something he had not done in 6 years of patience and strategy and careful restraint. He went directly to Westbrook Hall. The butler who opened the door at 11:30 to find the Duke of Darlington on the step, unannounced, unsmiling, radiating a fury so controlled it was more frightening than any outburst, would later tell the housekeeper that he had never, in 40 years of service, seen a human being look quite so dangerous. "Where is Lord Westbrook?" Marius said. "His lordship is in his study, your grace, but—" Marius walked past him. He knew the layout of the house. Graves had provided floor plans years ago. He crossed the entrance hall, turned left at the gallery, and pushed open the study door without knocking. Godfrey was at his desk, with a glass of port and a stack of correspondence. Adela was in the armchair by the fire, her stockinged feet tucked beneath her, reading a novel. They both looked up. Adela's book fell from her fingers. Godfrey's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Marius closed the door behind him. The click of the latch was the loudest sound in the room. "Your Grace," Godfrey began, standing, "this is— You cannot simply— Sit down." The command was so absolute, so devoid of anything resembling a request, that Godfrey sat. Later he would be furious with himself for sitting, but in that moment, facing those grey eyes, his body obeyed before his mind could intervene. Marius did not sit. He stood in the centre of the room, between the desk and the fire, and he looked at Godfrey the way a man looks at an insect he is deciding whether to crush. "You struck your wife," he said, "twice now. You twisted her arm tonight badly enough to leave a mark, and tomorrow morning you intend to remove her to the country where she will be isolated, friendless, and entirely at your mercy." Godfrey's face drained. "How do you—" "I know everything about this house. I have known everything about this house for 6 years. I know that your servants despise you. I know that 14 of them have provided sworn statements detailing your treatment of Lady Westbrook. I know about the forged signatures on the bankside mortgage. I know about the tax returns you falsified in 48 and 49. I know about the bastard child in Shropshire you have never acknowledged. And I know that the woman sitting in that armchair—" He did not look at Adela, but she flinched as though he had pointed a blade at her. "Has been wearing jewels that belong by rights to your wife." Silence. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed midnight. "What do you want?" Godfrey whispered. "I want you to listen very carefully, because I am only going to say this once." Marius took one step closer. His voice dropped to a register that barely qualified as sound. "If you touch her again, if you so much as raise your voice in her direction, I will not wait for Parliament. I will not wait for the courts. I will destroy you so quickly and so completely that by the time the sun rises, you will not have a house to sleep in, a penny to your name, or a single friend left in England. And then I will come for you personally, not through solicitors, not through intermediaries, personally." He let the word hang in the air like a blade. "She will not be going to the country tomorrow. She will not be going anywhere you send her. And if I hear, from any source through any channel, that you have attempted to move her, isolate her, or harm her in any way, I will consider our current arrangement of civilized patience to be at an end. Do you understand?" Godfrey opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "I asked if you understand." "Yes," Godfrey said. His voice was barely audible. Marius turned to leave. At the door he paused. He looked back, not at Godfrey, but at Adela, who had pressed herself so far back into the armchair she appeared to be trying to disappear into the upholstery. "You should begin making arrangements," he told her. "You will want to be somewhere else very soon." He left. The front door closed behind him with a sound that echoed through the house like a gunshot. In the study, Godfrey and Adela sat in silence for a very long time. Then Godfrey reached for his port with a hand that was shaking so badly the glass rattled against the desk. Felicity did not go to the country the next morning, but she did something else. Something that would prove, in the end, to be the single most important act in this entire story. Keep listening. This is something that cannot be overstated. A woman in Felicity's position who left her husband, even a husband who beat her, would be the one destroyed. Not him, her. Society would call her a runaway wife. She would lose access to any children, any property, any standing. The law was not merely indifferent to her suffering. It was designed to ensure that her suffering continued. This is why she could not simply leave. This is why the Duke's plan had to be perfect. 3 days after Marius's midnight visit, Seaton Graves appeared at the servants' entrance of Westbrook Hall with a letter addressed to Mrs. Prue Hewitt. Prue read it twice. Then she burned it in the kitchen fire and went upstairs to her mistress's room, where Felicity was sitting with a book she was not reading, the bruise on her cheek fading from purple to a sickly yellow that somehow looked worse than the original blow. "The Duke of Darlington requests a meeting," Prue said. "He proposes the lending library on Curzon Street tomorrow afternoon. He says to tell you that he is aware of what happened and that the man who touched you has a very limited number of days in which to enjoy his current standard of living." Felicity closed her book. "How does he know?" "He knows everything about you, my lady. He has known everything about you for 6 years. The lending library was quiet on a Thursday afternoon. Marius was waiting in the history section, an alcove near the back, private but not compromising. When Felicity rounded the corner and he saw her face, the fading bruise, the careful way she held her left wrist against her body as though cradling something broken, something happened to his expression that made her step back. It was not anger. Anger was too small a word. It was the cold, focused, annihilating fury of a man who has been patient for 6 years and whose patience has just reached its end. "Sit down," he said, and his voice was so gentle it was almost worse than if he had shouted. He guided her to a chair. He crouched before her, and he raised one hand, slowly, as though approaching a wounded animal, and touched the edge of the yellowing bruise with his fingertips. Then his gaze dropped to her wrist, where the sleeve of her dress could not quite conceal the livid marks of a man's grip. "Who?" he said. Not a question, a demand. "You already know who." "I want to hear you say it." "My husband." His jaw tightened. The tendons in his neck stood out like cords. He removed his hand from her face and placed both palms flat on his thighs, and she could see the effort it cost him not to stand up and walk directly to Westbrook Hall and do something that would end with one of them dead. "I am going to destroy him," Marius said. "Completely, publicly, irreversibly. I am going to take everything he has, his money, his reputation, his standing, his mistress, his seat in Parliament, his name, and I am going to grind it to dust, and then I am going to marry you. I am already married. Not for long." She stared at him. "Divorce is impossible. It requires an act of Parliament. The scandal alone would—" "Felicity." It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it in his voice, spoken with a tenderness that contradicted every hard line of his body, made her breath stop. "I have 40,000 a year. I sit in the House of Lords. I have spent 6 years building a case against your husband that would make a solicitor weep with admiration. I have evidence of his financial fraud, his tax evasion, his forged signatures, his hidden debts. I have sworn statements from 14 of his servants. I have a doctor's testimony regarding the injuries you sustained on the night of October the 12th, 1849. Yes, I know the exact date because I know everything. I have the means, the influence, and the patience to drag Godfrey Sutton through the courts and through Parliament and through the pages of every newspaper in England until there is nothing left of him but a cautionary tale." Her hand was covering her mouth. Tears were running freely now, cutting tracks through the powder she had used to cover the last traces of the bruise on her cheekbone, and she did not try to stop them. She let them fall, there in the dusty alcove of a lending library, surrounded by books that had seen 1,000 stories, but perhaps none quite like this. "6 years, she said, her voice cracking on the words. "You spent 6 years building a case. I spent 6 years waiting for the right moment. The moment when the case was so complete, so devastating, so utterly airtight, that no court in England could dismiss it and no lord in Parliament could ignore it. I will not do this poorly, Felicity. I will not give him a single crack to slip through. When I take him apart, it will be permanent." He leaned forward. His grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made the room feel very small and very warm. "I am not asking your permission. I am asking for your trust." And in that dim alcove of a lending library on Curzon Street, surrounded by books that smelled of dust and leather and old paper, Felicity Varden looked at the man who had watched her for 6 years and spoken to her for 6 weeks and somehow known her better than anyone had ever known her. And she said the word that changed both their lives. "Yes." And then she reached into her reticule and pulled out a leather-bound journal. It was small, no larger than a prayer book, and its cover was worn soft from years of handling. She held it for a moment, her fingers tracing the edges, and then she placed it in his hands. "What is this?" he said. 6 years of evidence, dates, names, amounts, every debt he hid, every lie he told, every time he struck me. The precise time, the precise words he used, the location of the bruise, the dates Lady Cartwright moved into the house, the dates the family jewels were given to her, the servants who witnessed each event and their positions in the household, the name of the moneylender in Whitechapel, the solicitor who helped him forge the bankside mortgage. Marius opened the journal. He read the first page. He read the second. His hands, which had been steady through every moment of the last 6 years, through watching her suffer, through planning in silence, through confronting the impulse to cross ballrooms and break a man's jaw, began to shake. "You documented all of this," he said. His voice was strange, raw, almost disbelieving. "I read Blackstone's commentaries. I know what a parliamentary divorce petition requires. I know about the aggravating circumstances, adultery compounded by cruelty. I know that fewer than 6 women in English history have ever succeeded." She paused. "I also know that none of them had evidence this thorough." He looked up from the journal, and for the first time since she had known him, for the first time she suspected in a very long time, the Duke of Darlington looked completely, utterly undone. Not by grief or anger, but by something else entirely. By the realization that the woman he had spent 6 years trying to save had been quietly and methodically saving herself. "You extraordinary woman," he said. "I had no plan," she said. "I had no hope. I needed to write it down. I needed someone, some day, to know the truth, even if no one ever read it. I am reading it now." He closed the journal and held it against his chest. "And I swear to you, on my name, on my title, on everything I have, every word in this book will be heard, by the courts, by Parliament, by every person who ever looked away while you suffered. Now I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking, she kept a journal for 6 years. How? Why? And the answer is this: because Felicity Varden was never the passive, broken creature society believed her to be. She was a woman with a first-rate mind who had been given nothing to work with except books and silence and time, and she used all three. She had no solicitor. She had no allies. She had no money and no freedom and no one to turn to. But she had Blackstone and she had a quill. And she had the stubborn, furious belief that the truth should not die just because no one was listening. When Marius's solicitors later reviewed the journal, the lead barrister, a man of 30 years' experience who had argued cases before the Lord Chancellor himself, called it the most comprehensive piece of private testimony he had ever seen. Better than what most trained investigators could produce. It became the spine of the entire parliamentary petition. Felicity's own words, her own evidence, her own meticulous record, not the Duke's money, not his connections, not his power, was what ultimately convinced Parliament to grant the divorce. She saved herself. He gave her the army. But the weapon was hers. But before Marius could set his plan in motion, Felicity did something he had not asked for, had not expected, and that would prove to be the single act that made his entire case unbreakable. She remembered the journal, 6 years of meticulous documentation, dates, amounts, names, the precise wording of every cruelty hidden beneath a floorboard in her dressing room at Westbrook Hall. But more than that, she remembered something she had overheard 3 years ago during one of Godfrey's arguments with his solicitor. A locked drawer in his study desk. The bottom left. The solicitor had urged him to destroy certain documents. Godfrey, with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable, had refused. "I keep records of everything," he had told the solicitor. "One never knows when leverage might be needed." The irony of that statement would, in time, become the most satisfying detail of this entire story. Felicity sent word to Marius through Prue. Not a request for rescue, not a plea for patience. A plan. She outlined it in 3 precise paragraphs. She described the location of the drawer, the hours during which Godfrey was reliably absent from the house, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, when he visited Adela's sister in Kensington, and the name of the footman who owed his position to Prue's recommendation and who could be trusted to look the other way for exactly 12 minutes. When Marius read the letter, he set it down and stared at it for a very long time. Then he laughed. It was the first time Seton Graves had heard his employer laugh in 6 years. "She is remarkable," Marius said. "Yes, Your Grace," Graves replied. "She is also asking you to burgle an earl's private study." "She is asking me to let her burgle it. I am merely to send a carriage." On a Tuesday afternoon in June, while Godfrey was in Kensington and Adela was at her modiste, and the household staff had been given an unexpected half-day by a footman acting on Mrs. Hewitt's quiet authority, Felicity Varden walked into her husband's study for the first time in 6 years. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. She had rehearsed this in her mind so many times that the physical act of it felt almost redundant. The drawer was locked, as she had expected. The key was in the false bottom of his tobacco box, which she knew about because Godfrey had once, in a rare moment of carelessness years ago, opened it in front of her, forgetting she was in the room. He had always forgotten she was in the room. It was, she reflected as she turned the key, the most useful thing about being invisible. Inside the drawer, she found exactly what his solicitor had urged him to destroy. The original mortgage documents with the forged signatures, clear as a confession. Letters from his moneylenders that detailed the terms of debts he had hidden from every creditor. A record of the rents he had raised on his tenants, doubled and then tripled within 2 years, driving families from land they had worked for generations, with eviction notices served in December when the alternatives were the workhouse or the road. And at the very bottom, folded into a small square, a bill of sale from a London jeweller dated September 1845, the month Adela had arrived, for the Westbrook rubies, the sapphire parure, and the diamond tiara that had belonged to Felicity's predecessor as countess. He had not merely given them to his mistress, he had sold them and pocketed the money. Felicity took everything. She placed the documents in the lining of her cloak, a hiding place Prue had stitched the night before, and she walked out of the study, down the corridor, through the servants' entrance, and into the unmarked carriage that was waiting on the mews behind the house. She delivered the documents to Seaton Graves that afternoon. When Graves examined them, his fox-like face went very still. "These are originals," he said. "Yes. With these, the case is not merely strong. It is absolute. There is no court in England that could dismiss this evidence." "I know," Felicity said. "I have read Blackstone." Graves looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never seen on his carefully composed face. It might have been admiration. "I see why his grace is besotted with you, my lady." "Mr. Graves," she said, "I have spent 6 years being underestimated. I should like very much to stop." What followed was the most systematic destruction of a man's life that London had witnessed in a generation. I have to pause here and tell you, when I was writing this part of the story, I had to step away, because there is something deeply satisfying about what Marius did next, but there is also something unsettling about the scale of it. This was not a man acting in hot-blooded passion. This was 6 years of cold, patient fury released with the precision of a surgeon's blade, and every cut was deserved. Marius began with the money. He called in every debt Godfrey owed. And there were many, accumulated over years of gambling and Adela's expensive tastes. He purchased the mortgages on 3 of Godfrey's properties through intermediaries, then demanded immediate repayment. He contacted Godfrey's bankers and, through channels that only a duke could access, ensured that lines of credit that had been extended for years were suddenly, mysteriously withdrawn. Within a month, Godfrey could not pay his servants. Within 2 months, he could not pay his wine merchant. Within 3, he was selling horses. Adela noticed first. Of course she did. Adela, whose survival instincts were sharper than any blade, sensed the shift before Godfrey did. The bills went unpaid. The modiste sent increasingly firm letters. The jeweller on Bond Street declined to extend further credit. She confronted Godfrey in his study, and the argument that followed was heard by every servant in the house. "You told me you were solvent," Adela hissed. "I am solvent. This is a temporary difficulty." Temporary? The bankside mortgage has been called in. The racing stables are being seized, and I have just been informed that my account at Madame Leclerc's has been closed. Closed, Godfrey. "It is Darlington. He is behind this." "Then stop him." But Godfrey could not stop the Duke of Darlington. No one could. Because Marius was not merely wealthier than Godfrey. He was wealthier than most of the men Godfrey owed money to, which meant he could buy their debts, their loyalty, and their silence with the casual ease of a man purchasing a newspaper. Then came the reputation. The evidence of Godfrey's financial fraud was delivered anonymously to 3 newspapers and 2 members of the Parliamentary Oversight Committee. The forged signatures, the ones Felicity had pulled from his locked drawer with hands that did not tremble. The hidden debts, the tax evasion, the bill of sale for the Westbrook jewels. Each revelation was timed with surgical precision. 1 per week, each one worse than the last, each one generating a fresh wave of scandal that made the previous week's news look like a garden party misunderstanding. And each one backed by original documents so damning that no solicitor in England could argue they were fabricated, because they were in Godfrey's own hand. The Ton, which had spent 6 years laughing at Felicity, now turned on Godfrey with the savage enthusiasm of a mob that has found a new target. Invitations stopped arriving. Doors that had been open for decades closed with a finality that echoed through Mayfair like a judge's gavel. And then, the final blow. At Lady Pemberton's ball, the same ball where Marius had first approached, Felicity, because the man had a poet's sense of symmetry. The Duke of Darlington walked into the centre of the ballroom and stopped the orchestra with a raised hand. What he did next, no one in that room would ever forget. I certainly have not, and I do not think you will either. 300 people fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room without effort, "I wish to make an announcement. I have this afternoon filed a petition with the House of Lords for the dissolution of the marriage between Lord Westbrook and Lady Westbrook, on the grounds of his lordship's open and sustained adultery, compounded by acts of cruelty against his wife and systematic financial fraud against his creditors, his tenants, and the Crown. I have further submitted evidence of Lord Westbrook's fraudulent financial dealings to the appropriate authorities, and I wish it to be known." He paused, and his grey eyes swept the room with a gaze that made grown men look away. "That any person who offers Lord Westbrook shelter, credit, social acceptance, or assistance of any kind will discover that my memory is long and my resources are considerable." The silence was absolute. 300 people, frozen in their finery, champagne glasses suspended halfway to lips, fans stilled mid-flutter. Somewhere near the back, a woman gasped. Near the orchestra, a glass dropped and shattered on the marble floor, and the sound was so loud in the silence it made several people flinch. Godfrey was standing near the refreshment table. His face had gone the colour of old ash. Adela was beside him, and for the first time in her life she looked afraid. Her hand, which had been resting on Godfrey's arm with the casual possessiveness she had practiced for a decade, fell to her side. She took a small step back, then another. The distance between them grew, and everyone in the room watched it happen, and everyone in the room understood what it meant. Marius was not finished. He turned to face Godfrey directly, and when he spoke, his voice dropped to a register that did not need volume to terrify. "You struck her," he said. "You struck a woman who had done nothing but endure your cruelty with more grace than you deserved. You took her youth, her dignity, her joy, and you gave it to a woman who is not fit to stand in her shadow. And you did all of this believing there would be no consequences. You were wrong." Godfrey opened his mouth. No sound came out. He looked around the room, at the faces of people who had dined at his table, accepted his hospitality, laughed at his jests, and ignored his sins. And he searched for a single ally, a single sympathetic expression, a single person who might speak in his defense. He found none, not one. The tun had turned the way it always turns, swiftly, completely, and with the absolute conviction of people who have always been on the winning side. He turned away from Godfrey as though the man had ceased to exist, which, in every way that mattered in their world, he had. Then Marius crossed the ballroom to the corner where Felicity stood. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. Every eye in the room followed him. He stopped in front of her, and the cold, terrifying Duke, the man who had just dismantled a peer of the realm in front of 300 witnesses, looked at her with an expression so tender, so raw, so completely unguarded that several women in the room pressed their hands to their hearts. He extended his hand. "Come with me," he said. Not a command, a request, the only request he had ever made. Felicity looked at his hand. She looked at the room, at the faces she had spent 6 years trying to please, the people who had laughed at her, pitied her, ignored her. She looked at Godfrey, who was gripping the edge of the refreshment table as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. She looked at Adela, whose perfect composure had, finally, beautifully, shattered. And then Felicity placed her hand in the Duke of Darlington's, and she walked out of that ballroom, and she did not look back. The divorce was brutal. I will not pretend otherwise. Even with Marius's evidence, even with the financial fraud and the sworn testimonies, the process took nearly a year. Parliament debated. Lawyers argued. Newspapers printed opinions that ranged from sympathetic to vicious. Felicity's name was dragged through public discourse in ways that would have destroyed a lesser woman. There were days she nearly broke. Days when the newspapers were so cruel she could not leave the townhouse. Days when anonymous letters arrived calling her a whore, a schemer, a woman who had seduced a duke to escape a husband she should have been grateful for. Prue burned those letters in the kitchen fire and never told Felicity about the ones that contained threats. But Felicity was not lesser. She had endured 6 years of marriage to Godfrey Sutton. A parliamentary debate was nothing, and through every day of it, Marius was there. Not beside her, that would have been improper, while the divorce was pending, but present, constant. A letter every morning delivered to the modest townhouse he had arranged for her, each one containing some small observation that made her smile. The way the light looked on the Thames that morning, a passage from a book he thought she would enjoy, a detailed account of how his cook had burned the breakfast toast and the entire kitchen staff had pretended not to notice. A sketch, badly drawn, deliberately so, of a cat he had seen on his morning walk that reminded him of her solicitor. And then, at the bottom of every letter, always, always, I am here. I am not going anywhere. She kept every single one. She stored them in a wooden box beneath her bed, tied with a ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to grey from the number of times she untied and retied it. On the worst nights, the nights when the loneliness was so heavy it felt like a physical weight on her chest, she would take out the letters and read them in order, from the first to the most recent, and by the time she reached the last one, her breathing would be steady and her hands would be still. One letter, dated February the 14th, and she would later learn he had agonized for 3 days over whether to send it, contained a single line. You are the bravest person I have ever known, and I include in that assessment every man I have ever met. She pressed that one against her heart and held it there until the paper was warm. Can I just say, this part of the story is why I love writing for you. Because this is not just romance. This is 2 people who found each other in a world that was designed to keep them apart, and they held on. They held on through law and scandal and cruelty and a year of separation, and neither of them let go. That is extraordinary, and I think every person listening to this right now knows exactly what that kind of holding on feels like. Godfrey fought the divorce. Of course he did. Not because he wanted Felicity, he had never wanted Felicity, but because the alternative was public acknowledgement of everything he had done. He tried bribery. He tried intimidation. He tried calling on members of the Lords in person, reminding them of old favours, implying that if he fell, he might take others with him. But 6 years of Marius's careful work had ensured that Godfrey had no allies left to call on and no favours left to collect. He sent Adela to call on Felicity with a poisonous offer. Withdraw the petition, and he would grant her a separation. She could live quietly in the country. No one needed to know the details. Felicity received Adela in the modest sitting room of her townhouse. She offered tea. She listened politely. And for the first time she studied the woman who had stolen her life. The sharp cheekbones, the carefully painted lips, the fingers that drummed against the armrest with barely concealed anxiety. Adela was still beautiful, but there were lines around her mouth that had not been there 6 years ago, and her eyes had the glassy, calculating look of a woman who can feel the ground shifting beneath her feet and is trying to determine which direction to run. You could end this quietly, Adela said, accepting the tea with hands that tremored almost imperceptibly. A separation would spare you the indignity of a public trial. Surely you can see that. What I see, Felicity said, and her voice was steady as stone, is a woman who moved into my home, took my husband's affection, wore my jewels, redecorated my drawing room, and humiliated me in front of every person who ever sat at my table. And now that same woman is sitting in my parlor asking me to be quiet, to disappear again, to make it easy for you. Adela's cup rattled against the saucer. Tell my husband, Felicity continued, setting down her own tea with a calm that belied the thundering of her heart, that I would rather burn than go quietly, and tell him that the Duke of Darlington sends his regards. Adela left, white-faced and shaking. She did not return. The divorce was granted in the spring of 1852. In the entire history of English parliamentary divorce, fewer than half a dozen women had ever succeeded in dissolving their marriages. Felicity Varden, now Felicity Hargrove, became one of them. The petition succeeded on the grounds of Godfrey's open adultery, aggravated by his documented cruelty, and the evidence was so overwhelming that not a single lord rose to speak in his defence. When the news reached Felicity, she was sitting in her small garden, reading. Prue brought the letter. Felicity read it once, carefully. Then she set it down, closed her eyes, and let the sun fall on her face. And she sat like that for a very long time, feeling the warmth sink into skin that had been cold for so many years. She had forgotten what warmth felt like. She was free. Marius proposed 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. He did not do it with a ring, or at a ball, or in any of the ways society expected a duke to propose. He brought her to Darlington House. He led her up the stairs, past the drawing room, past the library, past the gallery of family portraits, to the 3rd floor, to a door she had never seen. He opened it without a word. Inside, arranged on the walls of a room that overlooked the gardens, were 6 portraits. Her, all of her. 6 years, 6 paintings. Her at 17 on her wedding day, captured by an artist who had been paid to attend the church and sketch the bride while no one was looking. Her at 18, sitting alone at a supper table during her first season as a married woman. Her at 19, walking in a garden at dawn, dew on the hem of her dress. Her at 20, standing by a window while rain streaked the glass behind her. Her at 21, reading in a corner, with that faraway expression she wore when she thought no one was watching. And her at 22, the most recent, painted from across a ballroom the previous season, her face half turned toward the light. In that last portrait there was something in her expression that the earlier ones lacked. Not hope exactly, but the ghost of it, the memory of what hope had once felt like. She stood in the center of the room, surrounded by 6 versions of herself, and the tears came so fast and so silently that they were dripping from her jaw before she even realized she was crying. Marius stood in the doorway. He did not move. He did not speak. He let her look. He let her understand. 6 years, she said finally, her voice cracked and incredulous. You watched me for 6 years. Yes, you loved me for 6 years. I have loved you, he said, since the moment you smiled at a servant who had stumbled, and I realized that you were the only kind person in a room full of pretenders. Every day since has been an exercise in restraint. She turned to face him. The tears were still falling, but she did not wipe them away. She let him see them. She let him see everything, the grief, the gratitude, the years of loneliness, the fragile, terrifying bloom of something that felt dangerously like hope. I am not the woman in those portraits anymore, she said. I am older. I am tired. I have been broken in ways I am not sure can be mended. He crossed the room. He stood before her. He raised his hands and cupped her face. Gently, so gently, as though she were made of something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. And he said, "You are not broken. You were buried, and I have spent 6 years digging you out." She kissed him first. She wanted that later, wanted the memory of choosing, of reaching, of being the one who closed the distance. His hands trembled against her face. The most powerful duke in England, who had terrified a ballroom and dismantled an earl and waited 6 years without complaint, trembled at the touch of her lips on his. "Marry me," he said against her mouth. "Yes," she said. "Yes." They married in June, in the private chapel at Darlington House, with only Prue and Seton Graves as witnesses. Felicity wore a gown of ivory silk, lighter than the one she had worn at 17, so much lighter. And this time, when she walked down the aisle, the man at the altar smiled. She had told herself she would not cry. She had cried enough in this lifetime for several women. But when she reached him and he took her hands, bare, because she had removed her gloves, because she wanted to feel his skin against hers when the vows were spoken, she saw that his eyes were bright, not with tears. Marius Hargrove did not cry, or so she had believed, but his eyes were bright and his grip on her hands was tight, and his voice, when he spoke the vows, was not the controlled, measured instrument she had come to know. It was rough. It caught on the words. It broke, very slightly, on to have and to hold. She remembered standing in another church at 17, in a dress that was too heavy, saying these same words to a man who had not bothered to look at her. She remembered the weight of that gown, the cold of the stone floor through her slippers, the feeling of being a transaction rather than a bride. This was different. This was different in every way it was possible for a thing to be different. The chapel was small and warm and smelled of beeswax and the white camellias he had ordered because they were her favorite. The light came through stained glass and fell in colored patches on the stone floor, blue and gold and rose, and it touched his face as he looked at her, and she thought, This is what it is supposed to feel like. When the clergyman said, "You may kiss the bride," Marius cupped her face in both hands. He looked at her for a long moment, a look that contained 6 years of watching, 6 years of wanting, 6 years of holding himself together through sheer force of will. And then he kissed her. Not urgently, not desperately, slowly, thoroughly, as though they had all the time in the world, because they did, because 6 years of patience had earned them this, a lifetime of unhurried mornings and quiet evenings and the luxury of never having to rush. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. "I have waited a very long time for this," he said, so quietly that only she could hear. "I know," she said. "I am sorry I kept you waiting." "You were worth every second." Prue wept through the entire ceremony. Graves, who had served the Hargrove family for 20 years with the emotional range of a well-polished boot, was observed to clear his throat several times and stare very intently at the chapel ceiling. The London season that followed was unlike any the Ton had witnessed. The Duchess of Darlington, the former Lady Westbrook, the woman they had pitied and mocked and ignored for 6 years, appeared at her first ball in a gown of deep emerald silk, with diamonds at her throat that caught the candlelight like captured stars. She paused at the top of the staircase. She had learned from 6 years of watching, years other women do it, that the entrance was everything. The way you held your shoulders, the way you placed your hand on the railing, the way you let the room find you before you found it. She had watched 100 women make this entrance while she sat invisible in her corner. She had studied them. She had memorized the exact tilt of chin, the exact pace of descent, the exact expression, not arrogant, Not triumphant, but something quieter and more devastating than either. Calm. As though this was exactly where she had always belonged. The butler announced her. Her Grace, the Duchess of Darlington. 300 heads turned. She descended the staircase on the arm of the most powerful man in England, and the room fell silent, not with shock, with recognition, with the slow, uncomfortable understanding that they were looking at a woman they had misjudged, and that the man beside her was watching them with an expression that said he remembered every slight, every cut, every whispered cruelty. And he was choosing, for now, to let it pass. At the bottom of the stairs, Marius turned to her. He extended his hand, and in a voice that carried across the silent ballroom, he said, "Would you do me the honour of a dance, Your Grace?" She took his hand. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Felicity Hargrove, who had sat alone at her very first ball, who had never been asked to dance at Almack's, who had spent 6 years pressed against walls and hidden behind ferns while other women spun across marble floors, danced with the Duke of Darlington in front of every person who had ever dismissed her. She danced beautifully. Of course she did. She had practiced alone in the East Wing for years, Prue humming the melody, Felicity counting the steps with no partner, learning the movements in solitude the way she had learned everything else, alone, without help, without anyone watching. Now everyone was watching, and she danced as though she had been born to it. Light on her feet, steady in his arms, her face tilted up toward his with an expression of such quiet, incandescent joy that 3 women in the crowd began to cry, and at least one gentleman had to excuse himself to the terrace to compose his features. When the waltz ended, the room erupted into applause. Not the polite, scattered clapping of social obligation, but real applause. The kind that starts in one corner and builds until it fills every inch of space. Some of it was genuine admiration. Some of it was guilt. Some of it was the particular kind of respect that people give to someone they have wronged when they finally realize the scale of their wrongdoing. Marius lifted her gloved hand to his lips. He kissed her knuckles. He looked at her with those grey eyes, the same eyes that had watched her across 1,000 rooms, and he said quietly, "That was for every ball where you sat alone." She squeezed his hand. "I know," she said. "I know." The women who had mocked her came to call. One by one they arrived at Darlington House in their finest carriages, bearing gifts and compliments and the desperate, smiling anxiety of people who have realized that the woman they bullied now outranks them in every conceivable way. Mrs. Helena Fairchild came first, the woman who had purred how accommodating at that dinner, while the table laughed. She arrived with a basket of hothouse peaches and a smile so tight it looked painful. "Your Grace," she said, and the title seemed to stick in her throat like a fishbone. "How well you look! I have always said so." "Have you?" Felicity said. "I do not recall." The peaches were accepted. The visit lasted 9 minutes. Mrs. Fairchild left with a particular complexion of a woman who has been served her own medicine and found it bitter. Lady Ashton came next, the woman who had, at Lady March's ball 4 years ago, loudly remarked within Felicity's hearing that it was charitable of Westbrook to keep the plain one at home instead of inflicting her on the rest of us. She brought an elaborate arrangement of roses and a speech about how terribly misunderstood Felicity had been during her marriage. "I always thought you bore it with such dignity," Lady Ashton said, dabbing at eyes that were conspicuously dry. "Yes," Felicity said, "I bore it. The question, Lady Ashton, is why I had to bear it alone." Lady Ashton's roses wilted faster than her composure. She stayed for 7 minutes. The Dowager Viscountess Holt was the most brazen of all. She arrived without gifts, without pretense, and with the particular brand of directness that only women over 70 can carry off. "I was cruel to you," she said, settling into the drawing-room chair as though she owned it. At the Pemberton ball in '48, I told Lady Briggs that you were as interesting as wallpaper and about as decorative. Felicity blinked. I was not aware of that particular remark. Well, now you are, and I was wrong. I apologize. She paused. Your husband was a worm and his mistress was a viper, and I should have said so years ago. I did not. That is my failing, and I own it. Felicity studied the old woman for a long moment. Then she poured her tea, and she said, Thank you, Lady Holt. Would you like a biscuit? The dowager stayed for an hour. She became, in time, one of Felicity's closest friends, and the only woman from her former life whom Felicity genuinely forgave, because she was the only one who did not pretend. Felicity received the rest in the drawing-room. She served tea. She was gracious, because graciousness was in her nature and always had been, but she did not forget, and neither did Marius. Lady Thornton, who had hosted the dinner where the table had laughed, the dinner where Adela's friend had called Felicity accommodating while the room rang with their amusement, received a particular gift from the Duke of Darlington. Her husband's outstanding gambling debts, quietly purchased, were presented to Lord Thornton at his club. The amount was staggering. The terms for repayment were, by Marius's standards, generous. But the message was clear. As for Godfrey, his story ended the way such stories always end. The financial fraud charges resulted in the seizure of his remaining properties. Adela, who had loved his money far more than she had ever loved him, departed for the continent within a week. She was last seen in Naples, attached to the arm of an aging Italian count whose fortune was already beginning to show the strain of her expensive tastes. His parliamentary ambitions were finished. His friends, such as they had been, evaporated like morning fog. Within a year, he was living in rented rooms in Cheapside, drinking himself into a stupor every evening and telling anyone who would listen that he had been wronged. No one listened, and Felicity, Lady Felicity Hargrove, Duchess of Darlington, stood in the portrait room, on the third floor of her new home, beside the man who had watched her for 6 years and loved her for every one of them. And she felt, for the first time since she was 17 years old, the full weight of being alive. Not surviving. Not enduring. Alive. He came up behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin rested on the crown of her head. They stood together in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by 6 portraits that told the story of a man's patience and a woman's worth. And neither of them spoke, because some things are too large for words. She leaned back against his chest. She felt the steady beat of his heart through the layers of fabric between them. She felt the warmth of his breath in her hair, and she thought about the girl in the first portrait. 17, on her wedding day, with no idea what was coming. And she wanted to reach through the canvas and take that girl's face in her hands and say, "Hold on, he is coming. He has been coming for you since the moment you smiled." "Marius," she said. Will you commission a 7th portrait?" He turned her gently to face him. "Of you. Of us." His grey eyes, those eyes that had watched her across 1,000 rooms, that had seen her at her lowest and loved her anyway, that had carried 6 years of patience and fury and devotion without ever looking away, softened into something so tender that she had to press her hand against his chest to keep herself steady. "Yes," he said, "every year, for the rest of our lives." She rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The same heart that had beaten for her across 1,000 crowded rooms, through 6 years of silence and patience and unbearable restraint. She thought about the girl in the first portrait and the woman in the last, and the distance between them, not just in years, but in everything. The girl had been invisible. The woman was seen. And somewhere between the two, in a corner of a ballroom behind the potted ferns, a duke, had crossed 40 feet of polished floor and changed everything. Prue, who had stayed on as the Duchess of Darlington's personal maid, despite being offered a pension generous enough to retire on 3 times over, was later heard to remark to Seton Graves over sherry in the servants' hall, "6 years he watched her. 6 years. I have never in my life seen a man with that kind of patience." Graves sipped his sherry. "It was not patience, Mrs. Hewitt." "No? What would you call it?" "Certainty," he said. "He was never in doubt, not once." Prue considered this. "Well," she said, "I suppose that is rather the point of the whole thing, is it not? He was certain of her before she was certain of herself." "Yes," Graves said, "that is precisely the point." Outside London hummed and murmured and carried on, the way it always does. But in that room, in that house, the world was very small and very warm and exactly right. So tell me, what would you have done in her place? Would you have trusted him? Would you have waited, or would you have run long before the Duke crossed that ballroom floor? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.